Education and Creative Industries at Charles Sturt. So in terms of my professional practice that I bring today, I did my undergrad, Master of Business and my doctoral study all through CSU. My professional practice career was across public relations and internal comms in particular. So I worked across, I worked in a consultancy in Sydney, so I had a range of clients that spanned the financial sector, education and training in particular, which led to my relocation back to Bathurst and then eventually working at the uni. I worked with a number of clients providing a range of services in the not-for-profit space, and my portfolios of work largely fall into issues management, employee comms and policy development. Okay, so objectives for today on our Thursday rainy morning. Essentially by the end of the hour, I'm hoping we might get to the point where you can have a sense of who your stakeholders are and what they look like. And the second part that I'd like to work with you this morning on is developing how you might grow those engagement. So I've kind of structured the presentation into, we'll do the mapping at the first set, the outset, so you can get a sense of who's who in the zoo. The second part is looking at engagement strategies for internal stakeholders, external and online. So just to give you a sense of what other organisations are doing, that might provide some ideas for you that you can contextualise in your own business practice. Okay, so there's a couple of slides which are a bit lectury at the beginning just to give you a sense of what stakeholders are, and then we'll get into the more fun stuff later on. So essentially, what is a stakeholder? So technically a stakeholder is a person, a group or an organisation that has the ability to have some impact on your business or on your particular context or project. So stakeholders share a number of characteristics. They can have an impact on your business that can be either positive or negative. They can support or oppose your business, but more importantly, they can influence other stakeholders about their engagement with your particular organisation. And that's essentially the power that stakeholders hold. So why, as businesses, would we take the time out of our daily schedule to think about stakeholders? Is it important, and why would we do that? It's really because of the power that stakeholders have and the impact of their engagement with your organisation to influence in a positive or a negative way. So what should we do in terms of analysing stakeholders? It's really about thinking about who the stakeholders are and how we might engage with them. So it's kind of trying to get a baseline sense of what stakeholders think about your organisation, what you're doing now that works really well, what you might be able to capitalise on, but also what you might need to close down if that strategy is not proving effective. And it's also about looking at the business cycle where your organisation is at, what level of engagement, what resources you have, and contextualising that engagement to make it not an onerous activity, but something that you can do on a daily basis that's not going to overcommit your resources. So the mapping process that we'll do this morning really identifies who the stakeholders are, and then we'll go through a process of ranking those in terms of importance. So your organisation will engage with a range of stakeholders at any given point in time. That engagement process is not a linear process, it's more of a cycle. So you will cycle through that engagement, and the level of engagement with any given stakeholder will change throughout that relationship. So essentially, the idea of stakeholder engagement is to build a relationship with those particular groups over a longer period of time. So it's looking at what strategies you're currently doing, what you can build on, to identify opportunities to increase those interactions, whether that's an incidental interaction, a conversation, or whether it's something more planned and strategic like an online engagement or a face-to-face engagement. Then we'll look at ranking stakeholders in order of importance. The idea behind ranking stakeholders is to assist you in terms of directing your efforts and resources. So depending on how you rank the stakeholders that are connected with your organisation, will determine the level of activity, the type of that activity, and the level of engagement that you need to invest in that particular interaction to build that relationship with your stakeholders. And finally, we'll look at some opportunities for how to engage particular stakeholder groups and how you might apply that in your context. Okay, so in terms of mapping stakeholders, there are essentially 4 major steps that we look at. So the first step is identifying who the stakeholders are. So you will know that in the context of knowing your business, who your customers, suppliers, employees, who those groups are. And it's often easier to separate those stakeholders into internal and external. The reason why we do that is there are distinct approaches to dealing with internal stakeholders, so employees, for example, as opposed to dealing with external stakeholders. So that's one of the first steps. The second step is analysing those stakeholders. So that gives us some insight into the level of engagement, the nature of the engagement, and how we might go about approaching that particular engagement over a period of time. So remember, what we're trying to do is look for opportunities to increase engagement, whether that's formal or incidental, to build that relationship over a period of time. So stakeholder engagement very clearly aligns with relationship management and relationship building. So it's a longer term investment for any organisation. It won't happen overnight, and it requires a sequential ongoing investment in terms of time and resources to be able to execute that engagement over a longer period of time. The third step is mapping. So looking at the stakeholders that are engaging with your business, their level of influence, particularly their level of influence over other stakeholders, and how you can capitalise on that and leverage those opportunities for the benefit of your business. And the fourth step is prioritising. So looking at the suite of stakeholders that are connected to your business and ranking them in terms of order of importance. So that order of importance then determines who you need to engage with the most, so essentially where your effort and resources need to be directed. So we'll work our way through the 4 steps, and then we'll look at some engagement opportunities for you to take away and to implement in the next couple of weeks for your business. So the first step is really identifying who those stakeholders are that are connected to your business. So there's a range of different stakeholders, and here is just some examples. So there's the general public, which is great but not necessarily very distinctive as to how we might engage with those particular individuals. So if you break that down, there are a number of different groups. So customers, for example, are one key external group that you're all familiar with and that you engage with on a regular basis. Investors and shareholders, media, employees, advocacy groups depending on the area of your business, regulators and suppliers, and opinion influencers. So all of these different stakeholders interact with your business at a different level, at different points in the business cycle, and require different things from you in terms of an engagement interaction. I've given you a template for how you might approach mapping your particular stakeholders. So what I'd like to do is, if we can work through that map, so that gives you a takeaway at the end that potentially you can implement in your businesses. So essentially what we're going to do for the rest of the session is to work our way through doing a map, and then we'll look at what type of engagement strategies. I'll show you some examples of internal, external, and how you might apply those. And just list down this left-hand side who some stakeholders are. You might find it easier to split it into internal and external, which will just lead into what we're doing later in terms of engagement strategies. So now that you've identified who some of your stakeholders are, and some of you mentioned that that was a little bit challenging because you haven't necessarily thought about that for a little while, and that's one of the purposes of these types of events, is to get you to just step out of your ordinary context and think about who you're engaging with and how you might improve that level of engagement. So the second step in the mapping process is to look at the stakeholders that you've identified and look at the level of engagement that you have with those particular groups. So I've just given you some examples here of what might constitute high engagement and what low engagement might look like in terms of your context. So examples of high engagement with your stakeholders might be something like a joint project, an undertaking or a partnership that you might engage with someone external to your organisation. High engagement typically looks at regular communication and contact. So that can be in a range of different forms. It can be face-to-face, it can be online, it can be incidental engagement, so how that might work for your particular organisation. Typically, high engagement and regular engagement and interaction translates to higher sales and referrals. So we're looking at those opportunities for incidental engagement to grow that relationship essentially. And high engagement also means recommend that your stakeholders that are highly engaged with your organisation have had a positive experience with your organisation, has had great service, are more likely to refer that to their friends, particularly in the online context. And that is really important. So there's a regular survey that is undertaken every year called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and that kind of gives an indication across the business sector as to who stakeholders take notice of. Essentially for the last few years, what that's telling us is that people are largely influenced by what their peers are saying. So if one stakeholder has a good experience with your organisation, they're likely to refer that on. So the engagement that you do with your stakeholders is really important. Low engagement represents minimal contact. It's much more of a transaction, as opposed to the high engagement is much more taking steps to build a relationship over time. So that's kind of the difference between the two. So it might be an online interaction rather than a face-to-face, and it's less frequent. So if I can direct you back to your sheet, now that you've identified some internal and external, can you have a go at ranking the engagement with those stakeholders that you've identified as either high or low? Okay, so the next step is then prioritising the stakeholders. So the way that we can do that is looking at those stakeholders that are most important, that are less important, and that are least important. So I'd like you to think about the type of influence that the particular stakeholder groups that you've listed have on your organisation. And the way that we prioritise them is to look at two criteria, if you like. The influence that the stakeholders have on your organisation and the impact of that influence. So what I'd like you to think about now is the type of influence that the stakeholder groups have, with 1 being the most important, 2 and then 3 being the least important. The reason why I'm asking you to think about the prioritising is that we don't engage with stakeholders at the same level of intensity all the time, and depending on the stakeholder groups that you've identified, we'll come to working out how we engage with those and what resources, where you need to allocate your resources in terms of time, effort and people to execute your engagement strategy. So you need to, it also is a process of getting you to think strategically about who are the people that you're engaging with and why you're doing that, which helps justify in your own context the allocation of resources to direct that effort to engagement. So if you can have a go at trying to prioritise the people that are on your list, and then we'll move on to the next step. So the final step is essentially the last column on your chart in front of you, which starts to give an indication of the map of your stakeholders. So in that first step, we looked at the influence of the stakeholders, and now we're going to have a look at the impact. So this is just a very simple matrix that shows you the influence and the impact of stakeholders in a visual format. So what I'd like you to do now is see if you can put the stakeholders that you've identified as number 1, if you can put them into, so with your ranking, so your number 1 people will sit here, your number 2 people will sit in the keep satisfied, and the number 3 people will be in keep informed. So if you can try and plot those stakeholders in there, And then that will lead into the next section, which is essentially how you might look at some engagement with those groups in terms of internal, external and online. So essentially that is the first part of the first objective completed. So to give you a sense of who your stakeholders are, what their priorities are, their impact and their influence on your organisation, which tells you where to direct your effort. So now the second part is where you can just relax a little bit and I get to do some more of the work. So I've just constructed a range of slides, one internal, one external and one online, to introduce you to a range of strategies that other organisations are doing that might spark some ideas for what you can potentially do for your business and apply that in your particular context. So some engagement ideas that you might look at for engaging internal stakeholders. So essentially this is largely employee engagement. So what you might do to build and strengthen those relationships with your employees. And you could do a similar mapping exercise with the staff that you work with in terms of identifying those people that are more engaged with your organisation, that have the potential to be early adopters of change and to facilitate and engage other employees in part of the process, whatever that is that your organisation is trying to implement and achieve. So essentially they're like your champions. They're allies that can work with you to affect change in your particular context. So one of the critical things for building engagement with internal employees in particular is some notion of reward and recognition. So that doesn't need to be a massively complicated, expensive operation, but it really needs to be a conscious effort to reward and recognise the individual efforts of employees. It can be something simple like an email, right through to something like a professional development opportunity for a staff member that's performed particularly well over a period of time. Or it could be something like, depending on the size of your organisation, you might get them to shadow or mentor another employee or do something that's outside of their immediate work context. So they might be able to work into a different organisation or work on a partnership with another organisation. So it's just some simple activity that acknowledges the efforts of the people in your organisation. The point of doing that over time is it builds that relationship with your employees. You know how they work, they know how your organisation works, and it cements that relationship over a period of time. So your employee retention is important as well. An example of an organisation that's really good at employee engagement is Virgin Australia. They're really put forward as a case study of best practice because of their ability to listen to their employees. So we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So we should be listening twice as much as when we're speaking. So Virgin Australia have got a simple strategy that they've set up to listen to the concerns of their employees. So they do it as an online survey. So staff can fill that out. It's just a simple survey monkey that staff can fill out about particular issues that are affecting them within the organisation. So the survey is the first part of the process. What Virgin are really good at doing is looking at what the issues are raised by the employees and acting on it. So they prioritise the issues that the employees are raising and then they go, okay, this is coming across repeatedly by a number of employees. What can we do in that space to address that particular issue? Employee development is another really good strategy for building that engagement and strengthening that relationship with internal employees in particular. So the Hyatt Hotel are really considered to be best practice in terms of employee development. So their practice is that they only recruit or promote from within. So that's a distinct strategy that they've decided to implement and it seems to be working. So across a whole host of organisations, the Hyatt has the highest employee retention rate repeatedly over survey after survey about how they're performing as an organisation. Another idea for engaging your internal stakeholders, in particular your employees, is to really see your employees. So get to know them. get to know how they work, what their interests are, and try and capitalise on opportunities to increase that engagement on a range of different levels. So often we get into the practice of doing rather than taking a step back and reflecting. So looking at what the employee's interests are and how you might connect or engage with those. So it could be, for example, that you give an employee time off to go and do a community service project, or that your organisation supports a project that your employees are connected or interested in. So it's being aware of what issues are important to them and trying to build some engagement opportunities around those areas. Another idea for employee engagement is a simple survey. So they're often referred to as a pulse survey. So it's really a regular check at periodic times as to how your employees are travelling. Are they going okay? Is there a change in sentiment? What's happening? Are there particular issues that are bubbling to the top for the employees? And if that's the case, they're the opportunities for you to do some sort of engagement. So it can be, often they're an online survey, but it can be something simple as monitoring Facebook posts, seeing what employees are talking about in a staff meeting, or generally just getting up, walking around and talking to people. So those incidental conversations cannot be overrated. It's really important that you know your people, you know what their issues are and what their interests are. So there's opportunities for engagement at those particular points. It's also being brave enough, I guess, to have conversations with employees when they confront or challenge you, because they're really opportunities to do something and get employees on board. So if they're raising an issue that this particular relationship with a supplier is driving them nuts, try and unpack that and put some strategies in place to turn that into an opportunity rather than a threat for your particular business. Google, we all know and love Google. So one of the ideas that Google have is that they are completely transparent. So there are no hidden agendas. They've made a conscious decision that they will be completely open and honest and transparent with their employees, to the extent that employees within Google have a 20% allocation of their workload to do something outside of their normal work function. So that's a big commitment. Google are a big organisation, they can probably take that hit. But even if you can contextualise that to an opportunity for one of your staff members to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do in the day-to-day of their work. Mars Pet Care have a range of strategies to empower their particular employees. So there's a number of ways that you could approach that. It's linked back to the idea of reward and recognition. It's providing opportunities for employees to identify a change, be involved in that process and see that through. So it's identifying opportunities for employees to engage more in your business, to build that relationship over a period of time. American Express are probably well known for the quality of service that they provide to their particular cardholders in that financial services sector. What's important about the American Express approach is they're particularly focused on success, but they're equally focused on the behaviours of the people that lead to that success. So they reward and recognise employees' behaviour that models the values that the organisation is trying to achieve, and that needs to align with their business values. So it's looking at how you get to that strategic business objective, but also the way that they get to that, and they reward those staff accordingly. Okay, so some ideas for external engagement. So think about the external suppliers that you've listed on your particular table. So one of the critical things and one of the benefits that we have in being in a regional context is that we're pretty aware, without too much effort, of the issues that are relevant to our particular community and our particular stakeholders. So it's really, it seems like quite a simple one, but it's often something that we can leverage much more than what we're doing at the moment. So being aware of local issues, local events that potentially you can piggyback on or align your business with particular events or particular strategies to increase that incidental engagement. It could be something like being aware that it's Business Week, and can your business piggyback on some of the promotions or activities that are happening there. Or it could be a new development's coming into town. Is that relevant to your business? What could you do in terms of that space? It's also about building your expertise, profile and presence in the community. So being aware of what issues are around, if that's connected to your particular industry, could you make some sort of comment on that in a public forum? Could you make a media comment, for example? Could you run a seminar? Could you work with another organisation to piggyback to produce something around that cycle of issue or whatever's happening in the community? So it's kind of an external facing strategy where you're looking at opportunities for your business to engage over a period of time. The second one is about your relationship with suppliers in particular. So how you're accountable to those suppliers. Is it easy for them to work with you, whatever the context is, whatever that interaction? You need to deliver on what you promise and make it easy for other organisations to interact with you at every point in that process. The customer value is really about building your reputation and profile as an organisation in a smaller community. So what value you can provide to your customers, because remember I mentioned earlier that word of mouth, particularly in smaller communities, is really important. Media engagement, so I mentioned some of that when I was talking about the local issues, so there's a crossover and a synergy there. What are the local issues? Can you provide a comment or is there an opportunity for your organisation around a particular issue? Is it Disability Services Week? Is it whatever? And what can you do in that space? Jim mentioned accrediting bodies and compliance, so that's really about being aware of compliance issues, how you manage that internally, and using those opportunities for engaging with those particular groups. Investors, competitors, similar to strategies there would be delivering on what you promise, looking at what competitors are doing for a number of reasons to see what they're doing in that space, but also for looking for opportunities to do some industry-wide partnerships and engagement. So if you're a small organisation that can't necessarily pull off a particular strategy by yourself, it might be worthwhile considering partnering or doing that with a larger player so that you're still engaged in that space, but the onus is not on you individually. And community groups links back to the first idea of engagement. So being aware of what community groups are doing, are your employees members of those groups, and how you might leverage that opportunity. So some ideas for online engagement. So most of you are familiar with a lot of these platforms that I've got on the slide here. So Instagram is a really useful visual platform for online promotion. What the research is telling us, if you've got a hashtag that has a location tag with it, the engagement skyrockets. So that's something if you're working in the Instagram space. LinkedIn is more of a social hub for B2B networking, professional engagement.
B2B.
Business to business, yep. So lots of opportunities to work in that space. The research around LinkedIn is showing us that people that are on LinkedIn are more likely to engage with businesses that are also in that space, or that their colleagues' networks are talking about referring to in a range of other social channels. So see what's happening in that space. Engagement ideas for Facebook. Facebook is a really useful social forum to use for a range of engagements. You just need to be strategic about how you're doing it, and your message needs to be consistent across your social platforms. The biggest problem with Facebook is that it's often used as a one-way communication tool. So unless organisations are going to invest the resources to use it as a strategic dialogue, it's potentially a push communication tool that's one way. So you need to leverage that opportunity, even though it can be scary, to engage with people online, it often is really fruitful in identifying opportunities for your business and having those difficult conversations at times, or responding to problems about particular products or services, because that's the space where the innovation can come. A blog, so in terms of engagement, a blog is a longer form engagement. Blog is probably more successful as a maintenance strategy once you've established your relationship and your engagement through a number of other means. So it's more maintaining rather than building. The strategy that sits behind engagement in terms of blogs is really about growing existing relationships and value adding, if you like, rather than using it as a tool to set up and establish engagement. A webinar might be an engagement opportunity that your organisation can do. So essentially that's just a video presentation online about some aspect of your business or some area of expertise or some local issue that's affecting your organisation or more broadly your industry or sector. Engagement ideas for Starbucks are really clever. You might not like the coffee, but they've got some ideas. So they use their social platforms to really crowdsource ideas from people that are in their space. So they look at they've got a section on their website called My Starbucks Idea. So you can log on and you can put, I want a caramel latte with an Oreo on the top, blah, blah, blah. If they think that's a good idea, they can take that up. So they're really crowdsourcing the ideas of their existing customers to introduce new things. So whether you like it or not, it's kind of a cool idea. A podcast is an idea that you can tap into areas of expertise in your business. It's a shorter form of engagement that it might be on a particular topic. Because it's a shorter form, it's more topical. It's not a difficult thing for smaller organisations to do, so that's something that could be in your suite of online engagement. And finally, another engagement idea is virtual tours or experiences. So particularly in real estate, they've picked up on a lot of those activities. It can be virtual tours of particular regional areas, particular properties, to give people a sense of what that's like. So that's another tool to increase engagement online. Quick last slide. So 3 engagement do's and don'ts. It's really important that engagement is not a strategy that is separate to your business strategy. They must be intertwined. So what you're doing in the engagement space and the effort and resources that you put into that space needs to be aligned with your business objectives. So you're not wasting those resources. Focus internally before externally, so get your internal house in order before you can communicate that externally to your external stakeholders. There's lots of nodding, I'm sure you're already doing that. And also learn from past experiences. So you're not going to get engagement right the first time. The critical thing is that you look at what worked and what didn't and learn from the what didn't. What would you do differently next time? Do you need another partner? Do you need to build capability in a particular area? 3 don'ts. Don't decide on your stakeholders before your objectives. It's the cart before the horse. So who are you talking to first, and then what are you going to talk to them about? Don't jump into deciding on an engagement format. So that's really a conscious reminder to listen before you engage. And don't ignore internal concerns. So your employees are your most valuable asset. If they're grumbling or griping or raising particular things, they're generally representative of feelings of other employees and representative of the community in some cases. So don't ignore those concerns. That's not too bad. I think we're right there, 5 minutes late. So thank you for your attendance and participation. My details are there. I'm happy to chat. Send me an email. I'll probably see most of you around town, I suspect. So thanks.
Thanks, Sharon.